Straight talk about the issues you care about the most. It's LaVeist and ClaVille, empowerment for the culture. Now, your hosts, Dr. Will LaVeist and Dr. Eric ClaVille.
Hey, I'm Will LaVeist. He's Eric ClaVille. You tune into LaVeist and ClaVille, where we tell it to you straight the way it is from a black male's perspective, because it's like that. And we're kicking off season 2. Had a wonderful season 1. You'll be able to check that out. You can go and check the archives on our social media and any places where you can get your podcast. But today's show is on the importance of voting. You know, this is an evergreen topic that we should always be concerned about. And we're now, again, in the election season. We're now more than ever, I think, in the past few elections, we've seen how important the vote is. And more importantly, for us as African Americans, how important the rights of the black vote is, because it is absolutely under attack. And we want to spend some time in this show talking about voting history in America, also talking about the attack on the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and also look at Obama versus Trump, the legacy of that, and Biden in the future. So when you look at the importance of, voting, ClaVille, and thinking about it from a historic perspective, give us some background, some context of voting rights in America.
So, Will, look, you're exactly right. Voting is a topic that we should talk about often.
Absolutely.
We should always vote and vote often. Take friends with us and the like. On Sundays, and we have voting, and here in the Commonwealth, we have what's called Souls to the Poll Sunday, right, where the legislature has opened up access to the ballot box and allowed persons to vote on Sunday. Think about that.
Right.
You can take your church group after service or have a mini service or a prayer walk and go straight to vote. I mean, that's service within itself, public service. That's an opportunity for your voice to be heard, to be engaged at every level.
That's uncalled for. That was unheard of generations ago. Yeah.
a few years ago.
Right.
You're talking generations, but you're actually right. And it's at a point where you can look back and say, wow, thank God, look at where we've come from, but we have a much further to go. Now, when you talk about where we come from, and you talk about years ago, keep in mind that as black people in this country, we only got the right to vote recently, in recent history, where we celebrated just a few years ago, 150 years of men's suffrage, black men's suffrage, with the passage of course, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote, not women.
Right, that's an important point, because a lot of people don't recognize that it was black men, and still at that time, women, period, in the United States did not have the right to vote. But yes, go ahead.
You're exactly right, because that was a point of contention between white women during the women's suffrage moment, and which actually started to become the women's suffrage movement, which of course we know just a year ago we celebrated 100 years of women's suffrage as a whole with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. We celebrated that in the year of 2020, and which was a watershed year, really a bellwether moment for all of us as it relates to the impact of voting and the like. So when you talk about the history of voting, we've only received the right to vote a short time in our history, but we've only been given the protections to actually go vote in the last 50 years by the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
Right.
Because keep in mind, right after the passage of the Civil War amendments, we went into a time period of Jim Crow, legalized segregation, violence at the polls. As a matter of fact, a lot of these laws are still in the books in a lot of states where you have poll tax, grandfather clause, literacy tests. Guess how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Guess how many jellies in a jelly bean? Can you write and recite, the preamble of the Constitution? All these ludicrous roadblocks, and that's what they were, roadblocks to hinder the progress of America by hindering the progress of black people and women at that time.
So hold
because
on. So a lot of what you're saying, and a lot of times people don't recognize, is that from the very beginnings of America as a nation, there has been this movement to limit who can vote. And that strain continues to exist even to today. So, like what you said, in the beginnings, it was white men that had the rights to vote and make the decisions about the country. And then it was extended to black men. And then it took, still took several years for it to be extended to women. But I think it's important people to understand that it is as America, as the saying goes, as apple pie, to attempt to limit the amount of people who can take part in the electoral process.
Well, look, you hit the nail on the head. As a matter of fact, we're working on a book entitled The DNA of America, analyzing the U.S. Constitution. And in looking at that, I believe that what we see happening today is because of the foundation that was set years ago.
Right.
So when you see a fight against voting rights, it's because there were groups in this country that were not provided voting rights, that were not meant to have voting rights. You can go back to the Dred Scott case and listen and read the decision of the Supreme Court justice at that time, where he said simply the question is, should a group of people that were never meant to be a part of this country and have the rights of the Constitution be afforded that? In a nutshell, that's what he said. That was he said that's the simple question in Dred Scott, which I say is the legal case that helped to start, of course, the Civil War, as opposed to the first shot at Fort Sumter in 1861. So when we start to, again, look at the attacks of where the mainstream public policy is, voting, schools, how do we fund school, public education, right? And then in the opportunity, again, equitable opportunity to achieve, right? So it's because the question was, as it was during that time, were these people conceived to actually have the full rights as the country itself was created by the founders?
So you think about, here's the nation of the freedom, justice for all. You hear that, and we've been taught that as kids coming up through school. It gives you the impression that this is a nation where you're supposed to be able to come. Everybody can be fully who they are, who they want to be. They can have proper representation through their representatives. But the fact of the matter is that there has been and continues to be this strain, this long lineage of limiting who has the full rights to participate in this great country that we call America. And the ballot is such a critical part in a democracy where the vote, the majority rules, as well as the minority is protected against an overwhelming majority who may, just be overzealous. And this is how our democracy is designed to work. But it's key to understand limiting who can participate has always been part of our democracy as well. Now, you mentioned the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but right now Congress is looking at the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021. Talk about the connection to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that the John Lewis Act. John Lewis, the late John Lewis, my honorable frat brother, Phi Beta Sigma fraternity. He talked about that connection of his voting rights, of the act now, to the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Yeah, absolutely, Will. As a matter of fact, I believe that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were two of the most influential, powerful, and life-changing acts ever signed by the government. Why do I say that? It's because before that time, you had the ability of localities and states and really the federal government to abridge or put roadblocks in front of citizens as it relates to exercising their civil rights.
Right.
The same thing was the case for voting. Because again, civil rights covers a lot, but specifically, we had to have an act for voting. Right. So that goes back to what we talked about before, Will. Take a look at where the greatest attack is, right? I mean, we had to create a separate act specifically for voting. All right. And of course, we got the Higher Education Act as well, and so forth. So think about that. So in looking at that, during that time period, after the passage in 1965, all the way up to really the early 2000s, before there was a case that challenged it as Shelby County versus Holder, I'll get to that in a moment, we saw a proliferation of African Americans and women being elected to public office.
Right.
On the local level, school boards, city council, commissions, and the appointment also to what we call the appointment to other positions and the election of what we call constitutional positions, right?
Right.
We also saw the number of election of African Americans and women on the federal level in Congress, more specifically the House. Now, of course, we saw a breakthrough in the Senate with the election of African American U.S. Senator out of Illinois. We also saw another African American male elected out of the Senate in Illinois, which then became a president.
Right.
We saw the election of the president. So we've seen a lot in a short time. Keep in mind, 50 years isn't it?
Right.
You know, I mean, some of us look up and say, "Oh, I'm 50 now."
Right. I mean, you talk about people who have been here 400 plus years. You know, in slavery, right? So 50 years to actually have finally become full rights as citizens, and then now to have those rights challenged, which is why we have the John Lewis bill. Because talk about what happened with the 1965 Voting Rights Act and how the Supreme Court weakened that act.
Absolutely. So now with that act, we get this challenge. We've always had challenges around the periphery, right? You know, of where you could vote, polling stations, gerrymandering of drawing districts, stuff like that. Right. So now we get to this case, Shelby County versus Holder. Of course, this was a major case. It changed the landscape of what we're looking at now as it relates to voting rights. So 2009, 2010 decision comes out. And basically what happens in this case, well, actually 2013 decision comes out. What happens in this case is that the Supreme Court said that basically the formula that was utilized in order to determine states that were under what's called coverage, where they had to basically those that discriminated historically against African Americans and people of color had to submit any change in plans to the United States Department of Justice, Department of Civil Rights to get it vetted or what we call pre-clear. Right. So the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision broke pretty much on ideological lines, right? Right. Basically said that, hey, look at this proliferation of African Americans and women being elected to office. You know, we don't need this anymore because it worked. Right. And then from there, if the formula was now no longer needed, so now the pre-clearance was made inoperable and ineffective because there's no need for pre-clearance. Right. So now what ends up happening is that the moment that case was decided, we have states that go into, it looked like they had it on the shelf. They just dusted it off. Man, you saw the fouling of different laws and policies across states that historically had discriminated against Blacks and women, start to put that into action. And those laws were passed. We saw what we call voter ID laws being passed. We saw the limiting of polling hours, polling locations, the whole nine. So basically what the John Lewis Voter Rights Act looks to do is to basically restore what was taken away in the voting in Shelby County versus Holder from the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Now the thing, again, when you talk about history, you're talking about lineage, you talk about this string going through the DNA, is that if you know something about the history of this country, again, the Constitutional Convention where the founders got together and were deciding and arguing about how the nation should be structured. Yeah. This was one of the major arguments of how much, and I'll just, at the risk of trying to simplify it, because I'll leave all the history to you, but they were trying to define how much are you going to allow the states to have power to make decisions for themselves versus how much is the federal government should be able to override in order to keep the states held together. Because if you give the states too much power to do their own individual things, you can see very clearly how that would become very difficult to keep a nation together. If all of the states at that time, 13 and so forth, now we got 50 going off and doing all their own different things. So that was the key concern, one of the many key concerns, but that was a key one. And so now you see the evidence of that concern all the way down, looking down into the future. You see the evidence of that concern of if individual states start doing and legislators start making their own different voting limitations and acts and so forth, you get this situation where people can more easily become disenfranchised. And so now you're looking at state legislators have the ability to do what? Redistricting.
Absolutely.
So now if they change the redistricting in a certain way that can benefit a particular party over the other, and let's be clear, both parties do this. They both, when they had power, they change the districts to lean more towards their favor. But it creates this situation where you can now create districts that are much more favorable to one party over the other, which begins to disenfranchise people in those districts. So now the representative that you've sent to Congress is not really representing your views, whether it be from a Black standpoint, whether it be from in a regional standpoint. What's the regional concern of the people living there? And again, this goes right to the heart of one of the key arguments in a constitutional convention. So this is why history is so important, because the founders then were looking not only what was going on at that moment, but they were also looking off into the future. And here we are in the future. And actually now we're going back to the future in a lot of ways when it comes to this.
I like that. So maybe this should be entitled Voting Rights Back to the Future. But Will, you hit the nail on the head, is that, these laws just were not made, just with a whim.
Right.
These laws, these policies, this Constitution were created with a view on the now, the later, and generations down the road. I mean, so when you start to understand that, now we can understand why the fight is so important.
Right.
Why it is not just in one locality, but it's across states and across the country. Now, look, I wanted to point something out when we talk about what states were doing. I like using North Carolina. Right. North Carolina immediately started in implementing voter ID laws, just like the Commonwealth of Virginia and other states, got Texas and others that started to do it. So what happened was the court itself, the Supreme Court, refused to hear a case and reestablish the law that was struck down for voter ID. Now, under this, in 2016, the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal actually struck down the provisions of that law. And this is what they said. This is the language used. And this is from an NPR.org article, but it's also pulled from the case itself. It basically states, in its ruling, the appeals court said the law was intentionally designed to discriminate against Black people. North Carolina legislators have requested data on voting patterns by race, and with that data in hand, drafted a law that would, quote, this is the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal, federal court that's making this statement,
right,
that would, quote, target African Americans with almost surgical precision.
Wow.
The court said. Now, you think this was like, what, 1916, 18? No, this was 2016.
Wow. Right.
Now,
Back to the Future.
Right, just a few months ago, they did something very similar where the court refused to hear that particular law. So they're still trying. But I thought that was so telling that legislators request voting data by race. Didn't disguise it.
Wow.
Give it to me by race. And then they end up creating a law, draft a law like that. That's what the 1965 Voting Rights Act was created to stop.
Right.
And that's why the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is needed to restore.
And it's something about, when you said that it's happening right in front of us, right in front of our faces, and it's happening so boldly and so blatantly, because I assume as being a working journalist, when I was dealing a lot with politicians, again, the belief is that people are so distracted and so not paying attention that you can do things wide out into the open and folks won't really understand what it is, because they get so, if you can use language to get people tied up into just talking points and certain issues that they should either be for or against, and if the politician is against that issue and you're for it, then that's it. That's not my person. I'm not voting for that person. Instead of being able to actually look carefully and sort of analyze what is actually going on. And a big thing is that it's a numbers game. So we talk about different elections. We all know voter turnout, general election, because that's typically when the people are excited about a president being elected. So there's more energy and there's more vigor, people going out and voting for that.
Right.
But then you have these midterm elections, or you have these local elections, where in actuality, they're probably more important to you in the scheme of what happens in your locality, where you live, how your local taxes, state and local taxes are impacted, or whatever the case may be. We get this much lower voter turnout. So now these types of acts, people, they're not paying attention because they're thinking about, well, it's not the presidential election, or it's not big, but if you can get an election where the turnout is smaller, what does that also mean? That also means that a smaller group of people can dominate that election. So as you look at, for example, the Trump election, or the Trump base, as you hear them talking about, we all understand that is actually a very small percentage of the country who really is going out and leading insurrections and believing in so many of the things that Trump said.
Yeah.
But in a smaller turnout election, if they are riled up, if that small group is riled up, it can dominate that election. And it's not just I just used the Trump group as the most recent example. Right. Prior to that, you had, there's always been other, voting blocks. It was the Tea Party. That was prior to that. Or you can just go into history. If you've got an election where the voter turnout is smaller, that gives an advantage to a very well-organized, smaller block of individuals who may have views that are nowhere near the majority of the views in that locality, in that state, in that whatever the case is. And if you don't come out and vote, right, now
you give power to them.
You've given power to them. Now they're making decisions and making policies and passing bills that you don't agree with. And now you're wondering, well, what happened? What's going on? What's going on is you allowed yourself to be disenfranchised. You did not come out and vote. And by you sitting on the sidelines, by you not analyzing what's going on and paying closer attention, you've given the advantage to someone who is not going to necessarily be voting and making decisions in your interest.
Will, you mentioned their passing policies. And you brought up a very good point, that, a lot of people don't think about. And I really didn't think about it until you said it. And I just started thinking about all these policies that have started to become law because of that small vocal group. right?
Right.
Occupy Wall Street. There's those
That's
individuals,
right.
like you said, then Tea Party. Then there's those individuals that started to push now the Trumpers. And then you had individuals that are now pushing the voter integrity, issue. Now you have individuals that are pushing, freedom, the freedom movement with schools and mask mandates, vaccine mandates.
Right. Right.
So is that small group that's getting everybody's attention,
Right.
and that everybody's listening to, and that everybody's saying, hey, we want change and we're going to go to the polls and galvanize. And in a way, it's, of course, it, creates manufacturers fear, right? Until you actually vote and then you see that, hey, this wasn't an issue at all, right?
Right. Fear moves elections. Fear moves elections. I mean, it does. Yeah.
Absolutely. I never forget, there was an issue that, Trump was running on. And when he got elected, Mitch McConnell said, oh, we're not going to focus on that anymore. I mean, literally the next day,
Right.
But that was a campaign platform. He said, we're good. We're not going to focus on that because we won. Now we got some real agenda stuff to take a look at. I want to take a look at some real agenda, some real policy that's passed. When you talk about what has happened, so I'm going to the Brennan Center for Justice. You go to BrennanCenter.org, take a look at their research and reports. And what I like to look at are voting laws roundup. So it takes a tally across and it really compiles a lot of this research in one area and based on a certain section. So as of May 2021, and we're going to look at what's happened up close to this point. As of May 2021, states had already enacted 20 laws this year. Wow. Which made it harder for Americans to vote. And keep in mind, most legislative sessions weren't even in session at that time. We still have over half that were going into session. Now, you have 14 states that enacted 22 new laws to restrict access to the voting block. Now, this is on track to far exceed voter suppression of 2011. And keep in mind, 2011, we saw, of course, what took place then. We saw the Shelby County versus Holder case. We saw all of these cases come about to challenge the voting mechanism because of who was elected. Right. And the people that got out to vote. Right. Then by October of that year in 2011, you had 19 restrictive laws enacted by 14 states. So you see this thing is ramping up. Now, by June of this year, 2021, you had states that had already enacted 28 new laws to restrict access to the ballot box. And then from there, you had at least 61 restrictive provisions moving through 18 legislators. And then 31 had passed at least one chamber. Now, with that, basically overall, lawmakers have introduced 389 restrictive bills in 48 states in 2021 legislative session by June of this year. All right? Wow. Now, when I say that 30 more had committee action, that means that it needed a hearing, an amendment, a committee vote, those types of things before it goes to the floor to be voted in all the time. So we now, in like manner, we've also had at least states enact new laws that moved and provided access to the ballot box in a similar fashion. But here's the difference. Those laws that were enacted were in fewer states. Right. Laws to restrict were in more states. So that's where the difference comes in. And when we're talking about access to the voting ballot or the ballot box, we're talking about longer hours, opening up voting for go through the week like we have in the Commonwealth of Virginia. You can vote Monday through Friday and then on Sundays. And now the last 2 weeks of every election, you can vote Monday through Sunday. That means you can go on Saturday and go vote as well. Right. You see what I'm saying? So when we talk about, the power of the ballot box, we talk about the power of the people getting out there is in black and white. You can't make this stuff up. They're putting these laws on the books because the system and those others that know how important it is to vote. Important it is. And now you have these laws restricting access to the ballot box to discourage you once again.
Now, people might say, well, how is it that these states are passing these laws? How is it that this is possible? I mean, they're passing there's such a high focus on restrictive laws. I mean, don't we have issues in our states with the economies of our states or with healthcare? Isn't there other issues that are going on? So I know voters are probably to hear that and they say, well, how's that possible? Where these people come from? Well, you want to know where they came from? They came from, they ran for election in your state, right? During a time where you weren't really paying that close attention, apparently, to what they were campaigning on and what their policies were and what they really believed, right? And so now, as they gain positions in government, and then they caucus with other like-minded folk because it's a concerted effort with lobbyists behind it, with different interests behind it. There are people who who are paid and spend a tremendous amount of their time focused on how do we run certain candidates into certain areas so we can combine forces, gain a majority vote to move certain policies in the ways that we believe. There are people who are on a 24-hour basis thinking about these issues, or they have people who they pay to think about these issues and to strategize. And so, again, we're talking about the importance historically of voting rights and the attack on voting rights, and particularly the importance of the Black vote. If you're not paying attention in these smaller elections or these midterm elections or these local elections in your community, then this is where things happen and you get policies like these getting passed and you wonder, well, where was I at? When did that happen? Well, it happened right while you were right there and it was going on right in front of your face and you weren't paying attention. Like, for example, one of my pet peeves, you're talking about my old state, Virginia, is that if you ever notice, you don't see judges in Virginia running for office.
Nope.
Right? Okay. So someone says, oh, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, the big deal about that is it means that the judges in Virginia are appointed. Okay. So they're appointed by who? Well, they're appointed by people in the legislature, in the General Assembly. Yep. Well, why is that important? Well, if the majority of people who are of a party that you don't necessarily affiliate with, or they are majority of people who have policies that you don't necessarily agree with, guess what? Those are the people who are going to be appointing the judge that you may find yourself in front of if you have to come before the court with a personal matter. So what does that mean? Well, that means the judges are going to the judges are human. So while they're sitting on the bench practicing, they're going to be making decisions that are going to do, guess what you think those decisions that they make they're going to be thinking about when they make those decisions. They're going to be thinking about potentially, well, how does this decision potentially affect whether or not I can get appointed? If you don't think that really goes on, then I don't know what a world you're living in. But these are the types of things that are intricate things that go on that could have a direct effect on your life. What's your chances of standing before a president of the United States or that president making a policy that's really going to affect your house, directly affect your household, as opposed to you standing before a judge in the state of Virginia who was appointed by a legislator who maybe is of a party, right? Maybe of a point of view that you don't necessarily agree with. So when we see these kinds of laws coming down, whether it be abortion rights, whether it be voting rights, whether it be whatever, again, you can't separate the judges and the people who have to make decisions on these after the politicians have made the decision. You can't separate it. And I would argue that many of the judges, and I'm not going to blanket all of them, many of the judges in Virginia are also politicians and how they operate on the bench. It's
So,
just by nature of how it's set up.
yeah.
It's just by
And,
nature of how it's set up.
and to your point, the Commonwealth is one of 2 states
That's
that
right.
has that process of
Only 2.
advisement and appointment, right? So in a lot of states, judges are elected. And so that means you're only accountable to the small group of individuals that advises to be appointed. So you're not really accountable to the people. Now, of course, outside of high crimes and misdemeanors, you're only accountable to them. Some people say that's fair. Some will say not. I'm not going to get in. We're not getting.
But
into
only 2. But there are only 2 states in the union
Yeah.
that have that continue to have that policy, because that policy was a lot more popular prior to. But you got only 2 out of 50. Again, we are a democracy with the majority supposed to rule. If you see the majority, in this case, the overwhelming majority is doing it in another way, that should tell you something about, but again, to your point, and that's the point I was trying to make, you get a small group of people who are making a decision on these large groups of judges within the entire state that you and I, as individuals may have to come before to decide a serious matter in your life. This is why votes and getting out and voting counts. This is why it's so vital.
Absolutely. And I want to take a quick look at the voting trends of the youth, because we always talk about the youth of the future, which is true. They are.
Mm-hmm.
And take a look at how they're looking at this. So let's take a look at these trends. We had the Obama election, which saw a major uptick of youth of color.
Right.
People just overall vote in this election because they saw someone that represented them on many levels, right? Many levels. Son of an immigrant, an American citizen.
Right.
He was a biracial child who identified as Black, as African American, experienced, raised by his white grandparent that his mother unfortunately passed of cancer, struggling to pay for it through fighting the health insurance company to pay for it, which I believe was so near and dear to his heart to push that legislation through when he first got into office. Also, not only that, but then we also saw his family. It was a family that we can identify with, Will. Some of the African Americans raised on the south side of Chicago.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Father and mother in the house, working, blue collar workers, worked to put their kids through college, right, to get the American dream, and they attained it, both her and her brother, right? And then how beautiful it was, and I say this all the time. Of course, her father passed, his wife's father, and his father-in-law.
Right.
But how beautiful it was that they were able to move the grandmother.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah.
8 years of help.
And August Wilson couldn't have wrote a better story.
Right, and she wasn't the help either. She was actually the grandmother that was there helping to raise her granddaughters during a very magical time, but it was also a trying time because you're in a bubble. That's a very highly compressed and controlled office where their childhoods could have been affected. But I just, even when I think about that, I just like to reminisce about that because how beautiful it is, because we know that connection between our grandparents and our parents and the kids and how that struggle is being blue collar. You want the best for your children, and it happened, right?
Exactly.
It happened. So we saw that push. But I want to take a look at 2016 compared to 2020, and we're going to take a look at what the future is. So looking at Circle Tufts Tisch College, their election center, 2020 election center, it takes a look at the national youth voter turnout. And of the national youth voter turnout, basically of youth available to vote, you had 50% vote in 2020, as opposed to 39% that voted in 2016, right? And when you break it down by in the general election, of course, how they have it here through voter turnout, they estimated that 50% of youth voted in 2020. Again, an increase from 2016. The vote choice, and this is the point you want to get to, 61% of that 50% voted for Joe Biden. And 37% voted for Donald Trump.
Okay.
Voter turnout by race, ethnicity, and gender. White youth voted at the highest rate in 2020 at 61%. But youth of color, they say, appeared to be narrowing the historical gap. And of course, you're talking basically population, right?
Right.
In education. So young women voted at 55% at a higher rate than young men, 44%. Also, vote choice by race and ethnicity, there were major vote choices between race and ethnicity. 87% of Black youth voted for Biden, compared to only 51% for white youth.
Okay.
If you take a look at voter history, 20% of young people voted in 2020 were first timers, and that's significant. First timers in 2020. So ask yourself, would Joe Biden would have won if first time voters were not as high as it was?
Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah.
Now, of that, 40% have voted in 2012 and 2016, and 40% have voted in 2016 and 2018. We're talking 2018 midterm elections, right? And then when you talk about this voter impact on close races, look at the states according to Tisch College's analysis here. It states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, i.e., the three states that were the battlegrounds.
Right.
Right. It said that guess which vote were instrumental in being the swing. Young Black and Latino voters were the swing votes in those tight races for Joe Biden.
Right. Importance of the Black vote, importance of access. So if you can limit the access of that and target with precision that group, you can have a very, very different election, is what those things are saying. You know, and the other thing is that's really, I think about that because the numbers are striking, but it also makes me think about why was it so close in terms of when you look at the candidates and you look at the people who are running, and especially, you know, me being a New Yorker and growing up all my life and being very familiar with Trump. And it's like, why is it so close? But again, when you start doing the analysis and you start looking at what is really happening with people's lives,
right,
Black, white, or whatever, you start to understand that the system and that previous elections and previous administrations have not necessarily been working for a lot of people. And so people are beginning to look for anybody who is going to at least appear to be championing their interests, their goals, to maybe change the situation in their lives. And a lot of books have been coming out about Trump and the election, how he won, how he lost, the insurrection, all of these things. Some of the interesting things that people are paying attention and that they see in some of these profiles of the so-called Trumpers, a lot of them voted previously for Obama.
Yeah.
How do you, it's like, so how do you reconcile that? It's like, how do you reconcile it? So now when you just call them racist, or you just say that it was a white lash is why Trump won, it's like, no, you got to start looking at the conditions under which people are living, and how people are feeling about systems and institutions, and whether or not the government is really working for them, and start putting together a message that speaks to that in some way, in some meaningful way. And I just find that interesting. And then you have Obama's vice president now running, and it's still so close. And you have some of these people who previously voted for Obama who are now voting for Trump. Yeah. At some point, you have to just stop trying to simplify it and say, well, they're just all racist, or they're just all ignorant, or just this, or just that, or it's just that we're so polarized and they're just drinking the Kool-Aid from, right-wing media, so forth. At some point, you have to start really analyzing what's really going on here. What is really the conditions that people are finding? And are some of these decisions being made because someone is at least tapping into their feeling that they're being ignored?
Right.
They're not being addressed at all.
Yeah.
And can you, if you think about that as a politician and you come at it honestly and you come with policies honestly, I think that what you would start to find is that a lot more Americans would be coming together around common interests and common goals than you might think. We are in a very polarized situation. The internet makes it much, much easier for people to just get fed, red meat or blue meat, depending on where they're at. But I tell you, you can't or you ought not to just ignore that. There are a lot of people who previously voted for other candidates who are saying, "Hey, I'm putting my hat over here because my life didn't change when I put my hat in with the other guy."
Absolutely. Will, you come to a very important point, because we have midterm elections coming up here, in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's the off year. That is right after 1 year after the presidential election and 1 year before the midterm national election. And people usually utilize Virginia as the litmus test of policies, campaign slogans, and stances that individuals could run by. So what we see here in the Commonwealth, you see a race that wasn't close, but became close at the top of the ticket, what we call the gubernatorial race, which thereby also made the Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor race also close as well. So when you mention it may not be just individuals for party loyalty that are switching over, but they're looking at policy. In other words, are they seeing things change for them? As a matter of fact, again, going back to the importance of the youth vote. And again, I'm looking at Tufts, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, called Circle. They saw in the 2018 midterm elections that the youth voter turnout was estimated at 28% of eligible voters aged 18 to 29 cast a ballot in that time period, which doubled their estimate of 13% in 2014. Right. Now, you ask yourself, why are teens now, we call it, youth being involved? Of course, we know 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds still teens, but why are the youth, the future, so engaged in midterm elections at this high rate? So they came out of 2016, they were getting ready for 2020. We saw that upward trajectory, and I think we're going to continue to see it. Why is that? It's because when you now understand and get a taste of your power to vote, you're looking to push and change the narrative for those individuals who are delivering. Right. One thing that the current president ran on was student loan forgiveness.
Right.
And this group that I just mentioned, 18 to 29.
That's a big issue. That's a huge issue for them. Right.
Well, I would say that's probably, other than getting back to school, right, is the number one issue that's hindering a lot of college-age kids.
So if he doesn't deliver on that, right, you can rest assured that a lot of them are going to start looking at another candidate who, if they can articulate it correctly and they can make a promise that they will believe that they'll deliver on it, you might have some people jumping ship, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if you look at the 2018 and going back to this graph, 67% of that 28% voted Democrat. 32% voted Republican. And that's showing still that trend, right? That trend going this way. This way for Democrats, this way for Republicans, right? Because of the policies. But I believe you're going to start to see that shift when you start talking about common ground. Right. Who is that leader that's going to rise up and say, listen, I believe that we have more things in common than we have apart from each other. Let's come together on these common sense policies that impact us all in a positive way so that we can all boats can then rise with the tide, as opposed to those without boats drowning and a tidal wave or tsunami taking under those who are barely holding on, right? I think when you get that politician, that leader, that public servant that rises up to that particular point where, the infighting has to stop, the bitter partisan shakedowns, all that has to stop. I think you're going to see a change in just not only party elections, but a change in the voting electorate as a whole, that they're going to start casting their vote for common sense policy for common problems and common issues for a common solution.
And I think that it may not come down to a large slate of common ground issues. It may come down to one or two real key issues that either side can jump on board on, that either side can go into the booth and hold its nose, right? And vote for the guy that is going to push that issue. And so as we look at what's going on with the economy, we look at what the pandemic has wrought, there's a lot of common pain that people have experienced. So to your point, if somebody can come in and speak to that common pain, and it doesn't have to be a large slate of issues, and that frustration that people have about both of these parties failing to really be able to govern and legislate and move things forward, I think you're going to have some possibilities, because you can only stay in this position, in this state that we're in now, for so long. There's going to be a sea change. And again, when you talk about the history of this country, the history of how things work, the different movements and changes, and it's inevitable that kind of change is going to come.
Well, I think you're right. So the question now becomes, from Obama to Trump to Biden, now the future. So when we talk about the future, we talk about voting trends. Again, as the years pass by, as we add 4 more years upon all of our lives in voting, just in general, we're getting older, right? Our decisions and our responsibilities in life are changing, right? As we become empty nesters, as kids go through college and graduate, hopefully with no debt, we're praying, and working toward that. And as we start focusing more on retirement, we start focusing more on leaving a legacy.
That's right. Got to finish well.
Yeah, you got to finish well, and we start to focus on that. That group becomes a niche group, but that group also becomes a very influential group.
Right.
But we have a much larger group between an 18 and 55 or 18 and 45 that is going to be the majority of voters. And listen, politics is a numbers game, just like old segregationists had to do a about face to stay elected. Politicians are good at doing about face. And whatever's popular, that's what they're going to do. I remember, when you had the old school Democrats supporting Hillary Clinton during that election time period. And I remember it, and then all of a sudden they made primetime speeches saying, I see the changing wave. This young man and Barack Obama was coming up.
I covered that, man. You're absolutely right. I covered that election. I remember people, some folk, staunch Democrats, like you said, old schoolers that were saying, we don't even know this guy. Many of us got into government and got into the administration through the Clinton administration, through Bill Clinton's administration. We don't know this guy. And then all of a sudden, like you said, oh, I see change.
Absolutely.
They got on board. Again, politicians, that's the nature of politics. People would have never thought they would have heard George Wallace, who in the 60s was saying segregation today, tomorrow, forever, that type of thing. You go on YouTube and pull up some of George Wallace's speeches, in later in life, and you were just like, how would this guy have ever gotten to this point? Again, politics makes strange bedfellows, and and money talks. Yeah. And the other side of that saying too. But we're about to bring it home. I think our producer Ben, Big Ben, man, shout out to you. Season 1, now we in season 2. I think he's gonna want us to start wrapping this up.
Absolutely. Again, hats off to Ben Bailey, our producer, who definitely keeps us on point. The designs that you see, The shows themselves, absolutely phenomenal producer. And again, we're in season 2 of LaVeist and ClaVille. And this is our opportunity as friends, as colleagues. We've shared a lot of time together over the years. It's been almost 10 years now, Will, that we're approaching, being colleagues and friends. So,
well, I don't look a day older.
Not at all. Listen, we both age very well, right?
That's
so,
right.
Just great genius. But again, it's this type of engagement because we got to pass this on. We have to be able to talk upfront, honestly, in good faith about issues that are affecting us. And I think talking about it from an educated Black male perspective, growing up, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, going through integration, professional from the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, and coming on this side, well, we think we got to figure it out, right?
That's right.
So we're working to really discuss a lot of these issues. But listen, LaVeist and ClaVille wouldn't be what we are without you, the supporters. So go to our social media, engage us, catch every episode. And of course, we have publications that are coming out at the end of season 2. So get ready for that. More to come about that. But as we close, the importance of voting is a topic, as I stated earlier, that's not just important now. It's important today. It's important tomorrow. It's important for my children, my grandchildren, and my children's children.
That's right.
Because it is the most powerful tool, according to John Lewis, that we have not in our democracy. And by utilizing that powerful tool, we can speak with our voices, we can speak with our conviction, and we can speak by moving the public policy, by moving the dial toward progress that's good for all. Again, common problems with common solutions on common ground is what's really going to get our country not just continue to move, but to stand greater today than it did yesterday, and it will stand even greater tomorrow.
That's the way it is.
So again, follow us on social media, click us on Facebook, like us, share it, and let us know how we're doing. At LaVeist and ClaVille, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to another episode of LaVeist and ClaVille. Make sure you subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. For information or to connect with LaVeist and ClaVille, check out our website at www.laveistclaville.com. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to @the LaVeist and ClaVille on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. This has been the latest episode of LaVeist and ClaVille.